Welcome to College Football Playoff Top 25, presented by Capital One.
Final weekend in October looms, and 2 weeks from tonight, on Election Day no less, the College Football Playoff Selection
we get our
Committee
first rankings on Election night.
Its first edition of the rankings, and a projection of the new 12-team bracket will be yours to digest. Glad to have you with us. College Football Playoff Top 25. Reese Davis with Booger McFarland, Joey Galloway, and Greg McElroy. Now, what we're going to do tonight is show you what the playoff bracket would look like using the current rankings from the Associated Press. Now, this is a new era of college football, moving from 4 teams in the playoff to 12. So as a refresher course, this is how the playoff goes. 12 teams will play for the national championship. The field will be comprised of the 5 highest-ranked conference champions plus the next 7 highest-ranked teams. Now, the 4 highest-ranked conference champions will be seeded 1 through 4, and they'll get byes into the quarterfinals. Then the other 8 teams will go into the bracket, including the 5th highest-ranked conference champions and the other at-larges. Now, home games will be a prize for the teams that are seeded 5 through 8, and then they will advance all the way to the national championship game in Atlanta on January 20th on ESPN. As I mentioned, seeds 5 through 8 host first-round games, playoff games on campus. What a remarkable concept, and it will be fascinating theater and excitement off the charts for sure. So that's how the 12-team playoff works. We're going to keep going over and over and over this again, because there will be some things that look a little bit different based on how the CFP selection committee ranks the teams. Now let's use the AP rankings to show you what it would look like, and we'll start going from the bottom of the considered field and up. The second team out of the field would be Indiana. Indiana right now is sitting 13th. The undefeated Hoosiers have Washington at home in front of College Game Day this weekend, Greg.
And one thing to keep in mind, last year the committee used an injury to somewhat justify keeping Florida State out of the conversation. Indiana's quarterback, Curtis Rourke, injures his right thumb last week in the game against Nebraska. He is sidelined indefinitely. Now, they've said that they expect him to return, but they have not yet given us a time frame about when he might be back under center, but that could have an impact on how we evaluate the Hoosiers.
Indiana might get in there.
The great Pete Thamel reporting, getting close, that they are optimistic that he will be able to go against Michigan State. And as Taven Jackson starts this weekend for the Hoosiers, there will be a larger body of work to evaluate Indiana should Rourke be out longer. A little bit similar, even though it was a long body of work, but Cardale Jones, way back in the first year of the playoff for Ohio State, had an impressive performance. So there will be opportunities for the Hoosiers that might differ a little bit from Florida State a year ago. First team out of the field, according to the AP rankings, for the second straight week. The team ranked 12th would be the first team out, and it's the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. They have a couple of big opportunities on their resume against undefeated teams, including Navy, coming up this weekend. So those are the first 2 teams out. So let's start looking at the rankings and then show you where the teams ranked would slot into the bracket as we unveil them. Boise State. Now, they are ranked 17th in the Associated Press, but they would project as the 5th highest-ranked conference champion coming from the Mountain West. That would put them as the 12th seed.
Boise was actually my prediction to be the Group of 5
Just
team.
ahead of Boise State, as you go up in the rankings, is
BYU out of freaking nowhere.
Now, right now, seeding and ranking the same
They've been
thing.
good, though.
BYU ranked 11th. They would be seeded 11th. What about number 10? Number 10 is Iowa State. Now, here is where things change a little bit. Iowa State is ranked 10th, but because the 4 highest-ranked conference champions go into the quarterfinals, Iowa State, Boog, would project as Big 12 champion, and they would get a bye into the quarterfinals as the 4 seed.
Yeah, no doubt. And Iowa State is playing really well. They're really a defensive-led team, only giving up 14 points a game, and they're quarterbacked by Rocco Beck, our former colleague Anthony Beck's son. And I just love how they play. And if you look at their schedule, they really got 2 big tests left. At Utah, home against Kansas State. And so the schedule sets up really well for Iowa State. As long as Matt Campbell continues to get this running game and get this offense going, that defense is going to be.
It's funny how Matt Campbell, he was a hot name and then disappeared for a couple years, and now he's back.
The rankings and the seedings, you'll start seeing teams get pushed down a line. So Ranked just ahead of Iowa State in the Associated Press poll is Clemson. Now, Clemson 9th ranked, but because Iowa State jumps into the quarterfinals, Clemson pushed down to the 10 seed. Just ahead of Clemson is LSU. LSU, same situation, ranked 8th, pushed down a seed because you have a conference champion.
We'll see, though. Clemson might be number 3 at the end of the day because they might win the ACC.
That everybody's going to get mad about because 9's going to have to go on the road to 8. And in this particular case, that would mean LSU would get a date on Rocky Top, 2 teams that do not play.
I'm in for that.
In the SEC.
That'd be an awesome
and
game.
Tennessee coming off that big win against Alabama and a date with Georgia coming up, Boog, in a couple weeks.
Yeah, a huge win against Alabama. And I just love how they played very physical. Dylan Sampson in the second half. And if you're Josh Heupel, if you can get Nico Iamaleava going and get this offense clicking, you got to love what
Tennessee's interesting because they got a championship defense. And 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, I would have said they can win it all. But Nico's been so bad. But if he does figure it out, I mean,
you're going to see it again with a team that's ranked 6th in the AP poll.
We'll see. I'm not sold on them yet.
They would be seeded 3rd, projected as the champions of the ACC. They would be the 3rd highest ranked conference champion. That would put them into the 3 spot.
Yeah, we'll see. Miami, Clemson.
After losing to Georgia, Texas fell a bit in the AP rankings down to number 5. Now notice they're pushed down 2 seed lines now. They're ranked 5th, seeded 7th. A Texas-Clemson game in Austin would be a first-round matchup. You see there's only 1 more spot left in the first round before we get to the conference champions. And just
BYU at Ohio
State.
Jesus.
Ohio State, after the 1-point loss to Oregon would be in the at-large field.
I would like to see Ohio State run Miami over, though. That'd be nice.
At-large teams. So, ranked just ahead of Ohio State at number 3. And this is going to sort itself out when these 2 play. Penn State and Ohio State. Penn State right now, Joey, projected as the 5th seed, even though they're ranked 3rd in the AP.
Yeah, and Penn State is a team that is playing a lot better football this season. Their offense, who had struggled to go down the field in the past few years, now is found
they
a
have
way to
Colton
get
Necky
downfield,
from
throwing a lot to
Kansas,
Tyler
someone
Warner,
that
at number 44.
Florida
should have
hired, but
Illinois
not
is the only
interested.
ranked team they've played so far. So a lot of people think they haven't really been tested. And when you look at their schedule, it sits up pretty nicely. They have Ohio State at home in a couple
Ohio
weeks.
State at home.
The rest of the games on their schedule are unranked teams. So
I still
Penn
think I'd
State
like Ohio
has
State
a
in that
big
game,
test
but
in Ohio State, if they get past that one, they're sitting in a really good spot.
Yeah.
The Penn State, Boise State, and that means the 2 highest ranked conference champions, number 2 and number 1. Georgia, after winning at Texas, will be projected as the SEC champion. Oregon back to number 1 in the polls for the first time since 2012, and number 1 in the projections for the college football playoff. And just a note, Joey talked about how the schedule set up for Penn State. If it were to get past Ohio State at home, and Penn State and Oregon can meet with a bye into the quarterfinals on the line in the Big Ten championship game. So as you look at this now, Greg, what is it that jumps out at you right now about the projections and how these teams are stacking up, at least as it looks in the AP poll?
Oh, I love so much how this is all going to play out. And you already referenced it, and the fact that maybe it's Tennessee and LSU, and knowing that that's going to be a huge point of contention. Who's at home, who's on the road. That's going to be fascinating. But right now we've kind of cast a couple of programs aside because the AP poll is a little bit different than the College Football Playoff Selection Committee's poll, more than likely, that we see here in a couple weeks. So they have long valued great wins, teams with outstanding and high ceilings with a high talent level and the chances of potentially going and knocking off some of the top teams. So right now, the best win in college football is Alabama. Alabama beat the number 2 ranked Georgia Bulldogs. Right now, Georgia is the number 1 one-loss team. So how will that factor in? Bama also, when you look at the combined winning percentage of the teams they've played, they are 34-15. Only 1 team that Alabama's played this year is below 500, and that's South Florida. So I think that is something that'll be interesting because while the AP has a tendency to kind of regurgitate information from the week before, and there is some carryover, I think the committee, starting from ground zero and with the new foundation, it might look a little different with some of the teams that have been pushed aside.
I think what's interesting is because these conferences have added so many teams, I think there's 18 teams in the Big Ten. The SEC is huge now. As we look at these schedules, a lot of teams get to avoid playing each other in the regular season. So Oregon and Indiana don't play. Oregon and Penn State don't play. You look at the ACC, Miami doesn't have to play Clemson. So there's a lot of teams that are setting up in their schedules to look really good halfway through, because when you look at the back end, the higher ranked teams that might be in the same conference, they get to avoid them. And then the SEC is really interesting. After week 1, who would have ever imagined that Texas A&M and LSU would be playing for number 1 spot in the SEC? So the way these schedules are setting up now, going to be a lot of fun and very interesting to see what the committee does with these teams on the back end that may not have been tested as much as some of the other teams, like an Alabama, like a Georgia, like a Texas. It's going to be fun to watch.
Is that really the top 2 in the SEC right now? LSU, A&M?
Brand awareness, because
Let me
you
see
mean
this.
to tell me that we can have a Big
Oh,
Ten
it is.
team with the record that Indiana has be kind of disrespected the way Indiana's being disrespected, because we don't really know about it. We don't really assume Indiana's going to be a football school. And Kurt Signetti say really simple.
Yeah,
hey,
I was going to say.
If you want to know, Google me. I win everywhere I go. And I get it. The quarterback is hurt right now in Curtis Rourke. But if you just look at the way that Indiana's playing football, it's good, solid football. They're physical.
Urban Meyer said this the other day, best coached team in the Big Ten on both sides of the ball, and that's
I think Indiana's being
definitely
disrespected
true
right now, because had that been a bigger brand with the record that they have, they would be ranked a lot higher. And so I understand why Indiana feels the way they feel.
You know, Boog, I was going to bust your chops a little bit about this, but I actually really like the point you brought up. The word that I've used when I've watched Indiana from their first game against UCLA is crisp. They execute at a high level. At the same time, when they played Nebraska last week, it was the first team that they'd played all season that currently held a winning record as of last week. So you can kind of understand where they're ranking because they haven't been tested. How do you balance that in your evaluation real quickly when you look at the Hoosiers?
Well, you're exactly right. You can only judge them based on who they played. And the first team they played that really pushed back a little bit, you can say, was Nebraska, and they mollywopped Nebraska up and down the field.
You could say that about
I
Texas,
think
too.
you
They
have to
didn't
pay
play anybody
attention to
before
not only
Georgia.
who they play, but when they do play those teams, how they play. And they left no doubt who was the better team against Nebraska.
And we're going to find out pretty soon about the Hoosiers. College game day going there this week. Washington would love to spoil the show for them. And, of course, they've got Michigan and Ohio State coming up in November, so that will tell the tale about where the Hoosiers wind up. Still to come, College Football Playoff Top 25.
Top 25 right now is
this weekend. That was a hit.
awesome.
You saw Blake Horvath running. And our playoff predictor, what will a win or loss due to some of the top teams in college football, and how many losses is too many in the SEC?
College Football Playoff Top 25 is presented by Capital One. What's in your wallet? And in part by Mercedes-Benz. You're watching College Football Playoff Top 25, presented by Capital One.
College game day headed to Indiana. Now, technically, the show has been there before, but that was an opening Thursday night of the season. Saturday, 9 a.m. Eastern Time, Washington comes calling, and the great Lee Corso, the former Hoosier head coach, will be there. They're also honoring Lee's Holiday Bowl champion team during the game, coincidentally, from the 1979 season. Indiana, everywhere you look. Heather Dinich, who does a superb job for us covering the College Football Playoff, writing about it, talking about it, also happens to be an Indiana alumnus. I believe that Heather often is required to leave her IU hat at the door, but right now she doesn't. Heather, we were talking to Booger McFarland. He thinks Indiana's being disrespected. Is Indiana being disrespected by the AP pollster so far?
You better believe it, Reese. I've got them in the Bubble Watch bracket this week, and I'm glad you guys are going out there to see the scene in Bloomington. I think those people will show up there.
I think they will, too. Heather, let's talk about the SEC a little bit. Georgia has a big win at Texas. Lone blemish on Georgia's resume is Alabama. They're suddenly reeling. How do you stack up and evaluate all of these teams in the SEC who seem to be beating each other?
Well, Reese, there are 10 undefeated teams remaining in the FBS, and none of them are in the SEC. This is the most wide open race remaining, as 5 teams in the SEC still have between a 30 and 50% chance to make it to the conference championship game. But Georgia is number 1 right now in ESPN's strength of record metric, and that's because of the win at Texas, and don't forget the season opening win against Clemson. That's why their resume is so good. But on the flip side, you've got Alabama, and their playoff chances sank by about 23% according to the All-State Playoff Predictor after losing to Tennessee. Now, it's not the 2 losses that are the problem for the Tide. It's how they have looked, Reese. One thing that hasn't changed in that College Football Playoff Selection Committee meeting room is wanting to see national title contenders. And Alabama hasn't looked like one because of turnovers, penalties, and sacks now for 3 weeks in a row.
I think Alabama certainly mathematically still has an opportunity, but there are far more pressing issues to try to get things straightened out than worrying about what might happen on Selection Day. They've got a lot of problems to sort out. Also, when you look at the 12-team bracket, and we projected it, and Boise State once again is projected to be the 5th highest-ranked conference champion coming from the Mountain West. But a big challenge coming up on Friday night against UNLV. What impact will that game and the Mountain West race have on this picture?
Reese, this is a monster game because it feels like that playoff spot is Boise State's to lose. They've got to go on the road against a really tough UNLV team. I talked to Barry Odom earlier this week. They learned something from their Friday night loss to Syracuse. They've got a veteran team. Boise State has Ashton Jeanty, who is in the Heisman conversation. If Boise State can run the table and win the Mountain West, I would be shocked if they weren't the committee's highest ranked team. But don't forget, Army and Navy are out there. UNLV has a chance if they win too. This is a fun one for the Group of 5 race.
Well, you mentioned Army and Navy, and we're going to talk to Rich Clark about that unusual situation that could crop up in the American. But what about the impact of Army and Navy and their dates with Notre Dame coming up starting this weekend, and then Army in November?
Reese, I'm going to this game, Navy, Notre Dame. I'm so excited about it. It is huge for both teams' playoff hopes. Army and Navy are 2 of the worst schedules in the country. They are going to need some help. Navy's going to get a chance to boost its resume with a win against Notre Dame. Notre Dame needs to boost its resume with wins against Army and Navy because of that home loss to Northern Illinois. But college football fans need to remember, they're in the same conference. They don't play each other during the regular season. So these are opportunities that they need to boost that strength of schedule.
Yes, they're keeping their game, their regularly scheduled game, on the weekend after a championship weekend, as they have for a number of years. It does not count in the American standings, and we'll talk to Rich Clark about the potential should they finish atop the American and play each other in consecutive weeks. We talked all these years, Heather, about Ohio State, Michigan, perhaps playing back-to-back weekends and other rivalry games.
That's going to be Army-Navy.
Who would have thought it might be Army and Navy that do it first? You never know.
So fun. America's Cup is full.
The playoff is the gift that keeps on giving. That is Heather Dinich. Does such a great job for us and continues to do so. Heather, thanks a lot.
Thanks.
All right, guys, you heard what Heather was talking about there. She talked about the Group of 5 situation. Greg, Boise State only loss being to Oregon, but they also handed Washington State its only loss, too.
Yeah, Boise is definitely the team to beat right now in the G5, assuming chalk flies when Notre Dame plays against one of the 2 academies. Now let's look at Washington State for a moment, because I have not heard one person talk about the possibility of Washington State being in the college football playoff. Guys, they're 5-1.
Yeah, I was going to say, aren't they 5-1?
Their combined record of their opponents, if you remove Hawaii, so they played one really bad opponent, Hawaii, remove them, the combined record is 23-11. That includes a win over Texas Tech. That includes a win over Washington. They did lose to Boise straight up. That's why this is a challenging predicament for them to be in. But according to ESPN Analytics, they actually have a 39% chance to win out. That's the second best in college football behind Notre Dame. So we could very well fast forward to the end of the year and we have a Washington State team who's played a rock-solid schedule comparable to that and in some ways exceeding that of a Mountain West schedule that's sitting there at 11-1. So we need to talk about the Cougars a little bit on the Palouse because they could be a factor here as things move forward.
And to clarify, Greg, what you're advocating for is for them to get in the at-large pool because they don't have a qualified conference to win the way Boise State does. So Boise State and these others have a little bit more wiggle room. So you're advocating that they're not in the AP poll right now, though I voted them in. That's what you're advocating for, is in a large spot, right?
They're the first team out. But
correct. Yeah, I mean, look, with all due respect to the Pac-2, or the Pac-12, whatever we're calling it right now. I'm not going to acknowledge that win on the road in Corvallis as the Pac-12 championship. I'm not. So I do think that there's a place for them, though, if they win out and Boise goes on to win and their only loss is to another team that's in the playoff, assuming there's chaos elsewhere. So I just think it's a team worth watching right now because their strength of record might actually be pretty decent as we fast forward to the end of the season when comparing it against teams that like Texas Tech, who might be in the Big 12, and Boise, who might very well be in the mix for the Mountain West.
And I think anytime you talk about schedules, and we talked about Indiana earlier, and Boog, you said that, you just got to go out and beat the teams that you play. And so it's the same thing with Army and Navy. And so I'm going to talk about Navy just because they have Notre Dame this weekend. They look really amazing. He's run for 10. He's passed for 10. He's done a little bit of everything. So if they can look dominant once again against a Notre Dame team, then that's a team that everyone's going to look like really good football teams, not just because they've been good on offense, but their defense has also played pretty good football. So the test for Navy is this weekend, and Army's test is going to come later on. If they can look dominant in their one test of the season, which is Notre Dame, then they will be in the conversation, the same conversation that we have about teams that schedules are not very strong, but when they played on the field, they looked very dominant against whoever they've played.
Navy had the impressive win against Memphis. That diversified offense that Navy's unveiled this year goes against a Notre Dame defense that's dealing with a number of injuries right now. But who's a team that's on the outside right now that maybe is not getting quite enough attention for its opportunity to make the playoff?
Reese, for me, it's got to be the Texas A&M Aggies. And I think we were accustomed to the old system, and we kind of forgot about them. They go against Notre Dame the first game of the year. They lose to Notre Dame, and all of a sudden, poor A&M is kind of put to the side. But all they've done is come back and play really good football, whether it's been Marcel Reed at quarterback or Connor Wigman. I think they have the best defensive line in America. That defensive line has been dominant. Wigman comes back. The offense is starting to figure it out. And if you look at their schedule, they got LSU this weekend. And by all in part, it's for who's going to be number one in the SEC after this weekend. And then the schedule.
Who do we have in that game?
Until that last game
what do you guys
against
think?
The University of Texas, that rivalry game, anything can happen in that. And so I think as we're trying to figure out where A&M is going to stack, they beat LSU and they set up that game against Texas. The Texas A&M Aggies could put themselves in really, really good shape. And on top of that, they would have two quarterbacks they can play with to go with that defensive line. And let's not forget the catalyst, Le'Veon Moss, who's been running the football really, really well.
And the schedule, as you mentioned, really important because with these big conferences, the schedules aren't the same, and it was set up for success for Texas A&M. Every massive game that they've had has been at home, and the ones that they will have, LSU is at home, Texas is at home. They did fall to Notre Dame at home in a non-conference game, but the rest of it, they miss a lot of the perceived contenders in the SEC outside of LSU and then Texas at the end. So A&M's just steadily gotten better since that opening night loss against the Fighting Irish. We'll break down the playoff predictors, some of the scenarios that the guys want to play out and who might be able to carry his team on a playoff run. Not so much for Georgia being an underdog for the first time in 50 games. You look at our All-State Playoff Predictor, and we did this on game day Saturday to sort of illustrate how many
this is a team that's still alive. No one's really talking about.
There are 9 teams with a better than 50-50 chance of making the playoff. Add in the 11 that at least have a 20% chance. You got 20 teams, and 28 teams have at least a 5% chance, even including teams, as Greg talked about.
Colorado.
Washington State is in that group. Colorado has a big game against Cincinnati. Cincinnati on Saturday is still in that group. A number of teams with opportunities there. So now let's look at the All-State Playoff Predictor and some of the projections and the percentage chance of making the playoffs. Now you say, how do they come up with these? It's all based on FPI projections. Now we know that there are upsets all over the place. So Tennessee, for instance, has a 67% chance to make the playoff, but with automatic bids to conference champions, if Tennessee wins out, which would put them in that game, then their chances of making the playoff, even if they were to lose a tiebreaker in the SEC, basically 100% to make the playoff. So you can win your way in no matter what. But among these teams, as you're looking, Boog, who are you keeping an eye on, and who would you like to see in terms of some projections? I think they're a little farther down the line.
No doubt. Well, first of all, 28 teams, Reese, is entirely too many to be looking at. But let's take a look at the little old Indiana Hoosiers.
Well, that's
they
because
take
you
on
don't like the
Washington and
expanded
see what it
playoff
looks like if Indiana. Right. Well, it's way too many teams. It's entirely too many teams, Reese. Let's take a look at Indiana. What happens if and when they beat Washington?
Okay, if they beat Washington
with their backup quarterback,
it raises their chances from 63 to 72% because it would put them in better spot for an at-large and also get them a little bit closer to playing in the Big Ten championship.
They get their quarterback back, they'll probably beat Michigan too. So what, are they going to have one loss?
Takes into consideration what their chances are of, say, beating Ohio State or beating Michigan along the way, and they'd have better than 70%.
They don't play anybody else. They don't play Penn State.
If they simply beat Washington on Saturday. So are you satisfied with that now, Boog?
I'm satisfied with that on Indiana.
Okay, you're satisfied with Indiana. Joey, who are you watching here?
I got my own Notre Dame.
Here's Notre Dame. Notre Dame's got a 55% chance while Joey regains his composure here. 55% chance right now. The Northern Illinois loss undoubtedly is hurting that number because it's going to hurt their overall FPI. It's going to hurt their projections. Not a lot of big games left, but two undefeated teams in Navy and Army right now. Just take a look, Joey, at what happens if the Fighting Irish just beat Navy. Oh, not much happens. That shows you the regard the FPI has for Navy right now. So it doesn't help them a lot. It just avoids hurting them.
Here's the thing, though, Reese. But here's the thing to keep in mind, Reese, when you talk about Notre Dame. They have a really outstanding win to open the season that is only looking better as this season goes along. They went to Texas A&M and won that game. So that, if Texas A&M continues to win, is on a Notre Dame's resume.
So Notre Dame has the best chance in the country to win out.
Is one of the worst losses of the season, but they do have Navy, they have Army. They would hope that USC would start to look a little better, but Notre Dame, I wouldn't be worried if they continue to win out.
Now, you had that Florida State game that they thought would be a resume builder. That's not going to help them either. But look what happens, and I would assume about the same thing would happen if they were to lose to Army, Joey. If Notre Dame loses to Navy, their chances of making the playoff drops all the way to 11%. Right now, Marcus Freeman's team with a 55% chance to make the playoff. Greg, who do you want to break down here?
Let's get in the ACC. I think we got a really interesting scenario bubbling up in the ACC. I think Miami, we all kind of know who they are. They're looking really good. They're undefeated. But what about Clemson? And then secondarily, SMU. I want to see win out right now for Clemson, and then I want to see win out for SMU because both those teams could be 11-1 with losses in the non-conference.
Okay, well, here's what happens with that, Greg. If Clemson wins out because they're undefeated, this would put them almost certainly in the ACC championship game right there and winning out and winning the ACC and getting an automatic bid. And SMU, one would assume, would be in the same thing, but their percentage chance is just 92% with a win out. SMU has Duke this weekend. Clemson has the week off, the next game coming up against Louisville. So what do you make of that? Assuming
they'd have a better chance than Miami.
Tiebreakers in play here too, Greg. You could have a team that wins out but doesn't make the conference championship game because of the unbalanced schedules even in the ACC.
But it's crazy to think, Reese, that we could have a scenario where you have 3 undefeated ACC teams with Miami, Clemson, and SMU, none of which play each other. So the fact that they all could be undefeated, you might have an SMU team, like this points out, that wins all their games, still doesn't get to the ACC championship game, and then finds
they
a
leapfrog
scenario
Miami.
where they get in as an at-large ahead of the team that beat them in the tiebreaker, because the team that beat them in the tiebreaker, in this particular case Clemson, loses to Miami, which gives them the second loss that bounces them out. So we are looking at a potential
that'd be crazy. You'd be better off to miss the conference championship game.
The ACC as it relates to the conference championship and a possibility of an at-large team sitting at home.
Greg, look what I did here. I just gave you SMU winning out, which by definition they would assume that then Clemson had made it to the either didn't win out or didn't make it to the ACC championship game. Just SMU winning out without considering Clemson winning out puts the Mustangs almost certainly in the field, and it reduces Clemson's chance under that scenario with SMU winning out and Clemson not winning out to just 28%. Isn't this fun? I mean, think about how great this is going to be on election night when I'm up here, going through all of the things that the selection committee's saying and projecting, and the 13-member electoral college sitting there in Grapevine, Texas, is giving us all the things that really, really will set the direction of this country, much more than anything else that you might see on any other network on that night. I'm going to have this board humming that night when it comes in for the first time. Time to look at our Capital One rewarding performance. Some of those players who might be performing well enough to carry their team to the playoff. Joey, who have you got?
I like Cam Ward. He has 25 touchdowns on the season. He's been outstanding, and I think he's such a calming presence for the Miami Hurricanes. They've been in tight games the past 3 games. He's been sacked 9 times, 3 times per game in the last games, which have been closer than they would like, but they found a way to win. Cam Ward has been playing well enough to get Miami over the hump.
Yeah, for me, I'm going with Ashton Genty, running back from Boise State. I mean, he has been phenomenal all season long. Almost 1,300 yards rushing, averaging 9.9 yards a carry. And if you just go back at his game against Oregon, how he played almost...
Yeah, I'll go with Garrett Nussmeier. And this is a guy that at times this year hasn't really had the run game to take some of the pressure off the passing attack. Now, Caden Durham's come on, has been a little banged up from time to time. He's been a little hit or miss. So maybe the run game becomes a little bit more balanced for this team. But if LSU's going to get there, it's going to be on the right arm of Garrett Nussmeier and a really talented offensive line and a really talented group of wide receivers.
I would take all 3 of the guys you guys mentioned ahead of my guy, but I'm going to go with James Pierce Jr. Now, he had a big game against Alabama, led the SEC in sacks last year. As McElroy pointed out, and rightfully on his radio program, I believe, he really hasn't flashed this year until the Alabama game. Tennessee's team, that defensive line has to be led. And if he can get those types of performances, wreck game plans, let Nico Iamaleava continue to grow and improve, he can spearhead the run to the playoff, but it has to be led by Tennessee in that defensive front. Is that a fair way to put it, McElroy, real quickly, even though I know you said he hasn't flashed the ways to prefer?
Their front seven's freaking elite. I guess it doesn't.
I think it's coming on, though, really the last 2 weeks. If you look at, there's been times early in the season where he's disappeared a little bit. But in the Florida game, he was very impactful, stripping the ball on the goal line in a QB seek situation.
Yeah, that was great.
And then against Bama, he took over the game. So that's what great edge rushers do and great defensive linemen do. Boog never did it. But when you can take over the game at D-line, that's, I think, really, really helpful to your team. So I think it's a great pick, especially knowing the passing attacks he might see down the stretch.
Let me tell you something. Booger McFarland can take over a game now. I don't want to hear any Booger slander on this program. No, sir. Boog, I got your back there. Although, I don't know.
Appreciate it, Reese. Thank you, sir.
I mean, you can rush a passer. I'm not sure about dealing with the All-State Playoff Predictor over there, but other than that, I think I'm going pretty well. So to come, we'll talk about some of the high-impact games. Best versus most deserving. Rich Clark, the new executive director of the College Football Playoff, will join us.
I forget, we get a new playoff committee chairman every year. So
also ahead, we'll look at teams that might have a chance to win their way a little bit closer to conference championship games. Vanderbilt with another chance at a big upset. Can Texas bounce back after the disappointment against the Dogs?
Is College Football Playoff Top 25, presented by Capital One.
The 12-team College Football Playoff is here. So let's dig into how the teams can punch their playoff tickets. The 12-team college football playoff will feature the 5 highest-ranked conference champions, plus the next 7 highest-ranked teams as determined by the CFP selection committee. The 4 highest-ranked conference champions will be seeded 1 through 4 and receive first-round byes, with the 5th highest-ranked conference champion being seeded where it was ranked or at number 12 if its final ranking lands outside of the top 12. So that's who gets in, which brings us to where and when the games will be played. The 8 teams seeded 5 through 12 will play in the first round starting on December 20th, with the teams seeded 5 through 8 hosting a home game, meaning the pageantry of on-campus college football is coming to the playoff for the first time. Man, that is going to be incredible. From there, the playoff will play out as dictated by the bracket, with no reseeding between rounds. The quarterfinals and semifinals will be played at traditional New Year's Six bowl game locations, followed by the national championship game in Atlanta, where our first 12-team college football playoff national champion will be crowned on January 20th, only on ESPN.
Kirk Herbstreit reporting. And now let's take a look at this week's college football rankings, brought to you by Capital One. These by the Associated Press. As we've mentioned, still a couple of weeks away from the College Football Playoff Selection Committee unveiling their first set of rankings. As we mentioned earlier, first team out of the bracket would be Notre Dame in favor of the 5th highest ranked conference champion, which at this moment would project to be Boise State. The new executive director of the College Football Playoff is Rich Clark. Rich had a 38-year distinguished career in the Air Force, most recently serving as the superintendent of the Air Force Academy before moving into his role as the executive director of the CFP. He was also a standout defensive lineman for the Air Force Falcons in the 80s, and we're delighted to be joined by Rich Clark right now. And Rich, as I look back at your career in the 80s and our new College Football Playoff format, it looks to me like that at worst, you guys, if you'd had that format, then would have had a home playoff game. Might have come up short of the bye, but you had a home playoff game back then, right?
I think you're right. We ended up ranked number 8. So I think we would have had a chance to have an on-campus game potentially here at the Air Force Academy, and that would have been the biggest game in our history, I think. So I'd like to think that, but it's been 40 years, so it's hard to prove. But it looks that way. There's going to be a ton of excitement with those home playoff games and the other ones down the line with this new 12-team playoff. As you look at this and with the topsy-turvy nature of this, number of teams have been ranked number 1, all kinds of upsets, unprecedented number of upsets in one weekend earlier this year among the top 11. How will this committee and how will you define and execute best versus most deserving in making these evaluations?
Yeah, Reese, that's going to be a tough one. I think the committee's going to have their hands full with the selections this year. When we talk about best, most deserving, though, I think what we have to realize is that sometimes most deserving is equated to your record. You know, how many wins and losses do you have? I think best is about the entire body of work, though. It does include your record, but it also includes other things like strength of schedule, head-to-head competitions, common opponents, and how did you perform against them, and just sort of the eye test of those commissioners to really look at those teams and evaluate who's the best, because that's their job. Get the 25 best teams in rank order and then seed them into the playoffs. So with the way that this season has gone, though, it's going to be a tough job for them, but I think they're up to the task.
I hope people really underscored what you said about most deserving. Deserving, I think sometimes we look at this as being mutually exclusive. What you do to deserve it is a component of evaluating whether you're best, and it's something that the committee tries to execute. But within that, you talked about strength of schedule, common opponents, and with the sizes of these conferences, Rich, a lot of times there aren't a ton of common opponents. There are teams that are not going to play head-to-head. There are teams within conferences whose schedules are vastly different. How will the committee approach that in terms of determining strength of schedule and whether they look at non-conference schedules as being part of the mix as well?
Well, yeah, and that's a great question. We have some pretty good statistical data, though, that really goes throughout the season. It looks at all of the opponents of every team and how they perform throughout the season. And then it's able to make a very data-heavy determination of what the strength of schedule looks like and put them into not just a rank order, but really bends those teams that have the toughest strength or the best strength of schedule versus the teams that may be on the other end of that, and then the teams that are in the middle. But it's hard to compare apples to apples in the way that our college football layout is for the season. But I think that we have a good data analysis, a heavy analytical way to really take a look at that and find the right balance of what strength of schedule means to any particular team.
Rich, I've hosted this show since the inception of the 14 playoff.
Boy, I just know people are going to be mad.
I know you guys despise trying to get into hypotheticals. So I want to
wait till Herbie gets on here and starts throwing bombs at teams again.
What will happen? But in the event, Army and Navy are both undefeated, both with an opportunity to play in the championship game of the American Conference. Then, after Selection Day, they have their regularly scheduled game, which does not count in the conference standings. Explain to us exactly how that would be evaluated, say, if those two teams were to play in the conference championship game, and what impact the next game would have, which I understand to be none, would have no impact. Is that correct?
Well, I would say no impact on the college football playoff. Impact on the country, two storied programs. They're both crushing it this year, both undefeated right now. But like you said, if they were to meet in that hypothetical, if they were to meet in the conference champion, that conference champion would then be potentially one of the 5 conference champions that will go into the bracket. The next week, whatever happens there, we're not going to change the ranking or the seeding for the playoff selection. So that game won't count towards the playoff, but it will certainly count towards America, and it'll still be an exciting game.
It will count towards America.
And, I'm really proud of how those teams are performing.
It is a weird situation, though.
After the conference championship, we'll have made our selection.
And certainly both of them can have an impact on Notre Dame as well. Notre Dame looked to have this cruising schedule, and all of a sudden they look up and they've got both undefeated service academies left to play as well, starting this weekend when Notre Dame and Navy play. Rich, always a pleasure to be with you, my friend. Best of luck. Look forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you, Reese. It's great talking to you, and thank you for having me on today.
When we come back, we'll give you the games you really need to keep an eye on in Week 9, things that could change the entire playoff picture and what an LSU win at A&M might do. And let's take a look at the road test presented by Goodyear, and there will be plenty of them, even if you are taking a road test to a neutral site. At noon, as mentioned, no tour guide amateur photographer who's unleashed this Navy offense by new coordinator Drew Cronick that has him undefeated for the first time since 1979. That'll be a big one. Oregon plays its first game as an AP #1 since 2012. They take on Illinois. The Illini ranked. Last time they faced an AP top-ranked team, 2007, when they took down Ohio State, won that game. Alabama really scuffling. Mizzou escaped against Auburn. Both teams had Galbraith, a great running back for the Saints in the NFL. And then Texas and Vanderbilt. Texas had a little bit of a history in the last couple of years after physical or emotional games coming out a little bit flat, win or lose. Will that happen?
Yep, and this ain't the Big 12 anymore.
The Commodores are ranked, and they play as a ranked team for the first time since 2008. And then the nightcap, LSU and Texas A&M on ABC and ESPN. Elko have their teams fighting for the lead in the SEC. Greg, what do you keep an eye on out of those games this weekend?
Well, it's got to be the last one there, A&M and LSU. I mean, winner, they're in a great spot. They'll be favored in almost every game down the stretch, and if they lose one, they're probably still in a really good position to get to the SEC championship game. I don't know about you guys. You make the SEC title game, you're in the college football playoff, so that one's massive.
I'm looking forward to Notre Dame Navy. I think we got two really good quarterbacks in Riley Leonard and Blake Horvath. Both have double-digit rushing touchdowns. It'll be fun to watch go up against each other.
I don't think there's going to be a 3-loss team in the playoff. Alabama has 2 losses, so they are on life support right now. Big game with Mizzou coming to town. Brady Cook getting out of the hospital, coming back. Let's see what Brady Cook can do in Tuscaloosa.
Well, I tell you, Mizzou is really banged up, not just Cook. They have a couple other guys who are projected to miss that game 2 weeks away from the official rankings being unveiled. Galloway, will you still have the beard when the real rankings come out in 2 weeks or not? Maybe? Well,
I couldn't hear you.
He'll decide during Frozen Frenzy with John Butchergross, which is coming up right now.